I'd just gotten home from work when my phone buzzed. I remember reaching for it absent-mindedly, balancing the groceries on my hip, expecting maybe a coworker or a reminder from my mom. But I froze the instant I heard my husband's voice. There was no warmth in his greeting, just a curt laugh in my ear. He said, "I'm divorcing you and I've already sold the house," like this was some casual update. My chest felt tight, and the grocery bag nearly slipped from my arm. I managed to set it on the counter before my legs started to shake. I tried to ask what he meant, but he hung up. The hollow dial tone rang in my ear for a moment. I stood there, phone in hand, listening to that empty sound, heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. It's impossible to describe the way my mind veered between panic and disbelief. He wasn't just leaving me, he had sold the home we lived in without a single word of warning. That single phone call ripped away every sense of safety I'd ever known. That night, I couldn't rest. My hands wouldn't stop trembling, even after I forced myself to eat something small. I'd stare at the ring on my left hand, fighting the urge to wrench it off. My husband, Michael, had never shown me any indication he was planning this. Yes, we'd had disagreements. He wanted me to quit my job at the marketing firm to focus on starting a family, while I needed a sense of independence. But none of it seemed serious enough to lead to this. I paced circles in the living room, replaying the phone call in my head, trying to recall any clue I'd missed. When I finally tried to call him back, he didn't answer. He texted me later, "Deal with it." That was all. My stomach twisted so sharply I had to sit on the couch, pressing my palms to my knees. In the days that followed, everything turned into a legal and emotional storm. I discovered he'd somehow gotten his name on the deed exclusively, despite our original agreement to share ownership. My copy of the paperwork was missing from my personal files. It was almost like he'd orchestrated this for months, maybe years, and I'd been too trusting to notice. I met with a lawyer, a calm woman named Davina, who scrolled through emails and old documents with me. She frowned, noticing signature irregularities, but pointed out that if the house was already sold and the sale recorded legally, unwinding it wouldn't be a simple process. I felt a cold dread settling inside me as I imagined being forced onto the street. I tried to call Michael's relatives for information, but they wouldn't pick up either. My messages remained unanswered. One night, I found myself standing in the hallway, gazing at the picture from our wedding day. I couldn't stop my hands from clenching. Every memory of happiness felt like a distant illusion, overshadowed by the betrayal I was facing. The next morning, I called in sick at work and started boxing my possessions. A new fear swelled inside my chest. If the house truly belonged to someone else now, I had no right to stay. Every shadow in the hallway felt oppressive, reminding me that any moment, I might be forced to leave. By afternoon, Davina called, saying she was trying to secure a temporary restraining order on the sale, but there was no guarantee it would work. Usually, these processes took weeks, sometimes months. We didn't have that kind of time. My phone rang just before midnight. I recognized Michael's number, so I answered in breathless hope that he might have changed his mind, or at least offered an explanation. But he just laughed again, that same cutting tone. "I told you. We're done. You should start packing if you haven't already. I'll be in touch." The line clicked, and for a moment, the house felt dead silent, even though my heart thumped so loudly it filled my ears. I wanted to scream, to throw the phone. Instead, I gently set it on the coffee table. My vision blurred, and I curled my fingers into my hair, gripping so tightly I could feel my scalp sting. I tried to piece together the day we'd closed on the house a few years ago. He'd insisted on handling the notary, the official documents, guiding me where to sign. I was too distracted back then, caught up in the glow of a new marriage. Now, it seemed he might have manipulated the paperwork, forging or omitting my signature from crucial forms, ensuring only his name appeared as the rightful owner. That single realization made my pulse pound with fury. My arms prickled with a heated tension that wouldn't dissipate. Instead of wallowing in despair, I decided to do whatever it took to fight back. I felt my nerves buzzing when I met with Davina again. We sat in her cramped office, surrounded by boxes of files from her other cases. She tapped her pen on a thick legal code text, explaining that if Michael had indeed forged documents, that was a criminal offense. But proving it would be the challenge. We'd need a handwriting expert, a thorough review of county records, and possibly subpoena the notary or anyone else who witnessed the transaction. My chest felt so tense I could hardly breathe, but the clench of my jaw told me I wasn't ready to surrender. We spent hours combing through everything, emails, bank statements, even old texts. I realized Michael had always been secretive about the mortgage, changing passwords to our shared accounts so only he had access. Then came the blow about the money. He had drained our joint savings. All that was left was a pathetic $200. Davina shook her head. Without funds, it'll be tricky to wage a strong legal battle. Her eyes flicked to me. But we'll do what we can. I can request that the court freeze any assets from the sale until we determine if the transaction was valid. It's a long shot, but sometimes a judge will grant an emergency freeze if there's clear evidence of fraud. My stomach churned. I asked if we had enough proof. She gave a non-committal shrug. We'll see. Judges vary. But we'll file as soon as possible. That flicker of hope kept my posture from collapsing. I left her office carrying a stack of paperwork almost as heavy as the dread in my chest. When I drove back to the house, I circled the block several times before pulling into the driveway, irrationally fearful that a new owner might have already arrived, changed the locks, kicked my possessions to the curb. Instead, the windows were dark, and an unearthly quiet pervaded. I slipped inside, setting my keys on the small table by the door. My breath sounded too loud in the silent rooms. Everything felt surreal, as though my life was teetering on the brink of some unknown precipice. Late that night, Michael's text arrived, "You can fight all you want. It's useless." My fists tightened so firmly my nails bit into my palms. I wouldn't let him get away with this without a fight. Days stretched into a strange routine of crisis management. Davina filed a flurry of motions with the court, seeking a temporary injunction on the house sale. I struggled to keep up with her requests, bank documents, credit card statements, old texts indicating that Michael and I had intended to be co-owners. Each time I found a piece of potential evidence, I'd discover a half-dozen new complications, my name absent from official forms, his signature stamped across places it shouldn't have been. The neighbors started noticing something was off. One of them, an older woman named Harriet, watched me haul boxes out to my car. My grip on those boxes was so tight my forearms trembled, but I forced a small wave, not wanting to broadcast my panic. Amid these efforts, Michael was strangely unreachable. He'd occasionally pop up with a gloating text or a missed call, but never a direct conversation. I had no clue where he was living or what he was doing. All I knew was that the local realtor's sign had vanished from our lawn, replaced by a blank post. That sign had originally been a complete shock. I didn't even know the house was up for sale until after his phone call. Now it was gone, and I had no idea if that meant the property had officially transferred hands, or if Michael had simply removed it to toy with me. My attempts to glean answers from the county clerk's office ran into bureaucracy. Yes, a sale was pending. No, they couldn't discuss details with me if my name wasn't listed on the paperwork. My jaw ached from clenching so often. On the fifth day, I got a letter from a bank I'd never even heard of, congratulating me on my successful mortgage payoff. That morning, I nearly spilled my coffee reading it. The language indicated the house's mortgage had been cleared, presumably by the sale. There was no mention of me needing to move, no direct threat, just a cold statement of final accounting. But the reality hammered home, the transaction was done. I felt like a trespasser in my own living room. That afternoon, Davina called. Her voice carried a rare note of excitement. We got a judge to hold the proceeds in escrow, pending review. It's not a full freeze, but Michael can't touch the money until the court decides if the sale was valid. This buys us time. I sank onto the couch, tears edging my eyes. My heartbeat was wild, but it wasn't purely fear. Some relief, perhaps. At least everything wasn't lost overnight. We had a narrow window of hope. If we could prove Michael's manipulations, maybe we could stop him from enjoying the profit he'd stolen. I slept for the first time in days, albeit restlessly. When morning came, I took a walk through the house, letting my fingertips brush along the walls. This place wasn't just property to me, it was my home, filled with echoes of our early days as a couple. I remembered the time we painted the living room together, the streak of paint I accidentally brushed onto Michael's shirt, how he'd chased me around with a roller, both of us laughing. Now all of it tasted bitter in my memory. The betrayal had rotted those moments. I gathered enough courage to dial Michael's number again, but as usual, it went straight to voicemail. My voice quivered with pent-up anger as I left him a terse message: "We both know what you did. Enjoy it while you can, because I'm not backing down." It was a small, futile attempt at defiance, but I needed to say it. After hanging up, I slumped against the wall, exhaling a ragged breath. That night, Davina discovered a new twist: Michael had an overseas account. She'd found records of wire transfers from our joint savings, transfers I never authorized. He'd been funneling money out of the country, possibly waiting for the moment he could vanish with it. A deep chill traveled through my body as I listened to her over the phone. My nails tapped the coffee table, so quickly I nearly chipped one. If Michael was moving our funds internationally, retrieving them might be even harder, especially if local courts had no jurisdiction over his hidden accounts. Davina explained that we'd need to file additional motions, maybe even an international request, but that process was complicated, time-consuming, and very expensive. The helplessness infuriated me. My pulse thundered in my ears as I realized how thoroughly Michael had planned his exit. Still, the escrow freeze on the house proceeds meant he couldn't easily stash that money overseas, at least for the moment. If that freeze got lifted or if he found a loophole, I'd lose any chance of regaining what he stole. The only way to keep him blocked was to prove the entire sale was fraudulent. That meant depositions, forensics, and an avalanche of legal fees that I had no means to pay. My boss at the marketing firm cut back my hours, citing budget constraints. I suspected he saw the stress and chaos I was going through and worried I wouldn't be able to handle my full workload. So I had even less income coming in. Most nights, I lay awake in bed, fists balled in the sheets, trying not to spiral into pure despair. Around the same time, something shifted. Davina found a sympathetic ear in a judge known for being thorough with fraud cases. The judge scheduled an evidentiary hearing sooner than we'd expected. Davina's relief was contagious, but I could sense her caution. "This isn't a trial," she reminded me. "It's just a chance to show enough evidence that the sale might have been unlawful. If we succeed, we get more time. If we fail, the sale stands." My breath came out shakily, but I nodded, determined to see this through. We prepared meticulously, pulling bank statements, messages, and analyzing signatures. On the day of the hearing, I wore my best suit, hands trembling as I clutched the file folder. My throat felt tight the moment we stepped into the courtroom. Michael was there, seated beside an attorney in a pinstriped suit, calmly scrolling on his phone. When he finally glanced at me, I caught the faintest smirk. The memory of his triumphant laughter from our phone call flared in my mind, fueling a wave of anger so strong my stomach clenched. Davina presented our findings, pointing out obvious red flags, changes in the property deed that didn't match my known signature, suspicious wire transfers, even texts from Michael implying we were co-owners. I avoided looking at him until his lawyer stood up, accusing me of forging the texts. My jaw set so tightly it hurt. He claimed that our marriage was failing for years, that we'd lived separate lives, that I never had a legitimate claim to the house. Then Michael rose, stating in a measured voice that I'd agreed to let him be the sole owner, that I'd tried to trick him into staying in an unhappy marriage by demanding my name be on the deed. I felt a furious tremor travel through my spine. But I kept silent, letting Davina handle the rebuttal. The judge asked pointed questions, scribbling notes in a steady, methodical way. By the end of that session, the air felt thick with unresolved tension. The judge would give a ruling in a few days. Afterward, I tried to confront Michael outside in the corridor, but he turned and walked away before I could speak a single word. That final glimpse of his back disappearing around the corner made me clench my fists again, but then Davina placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "We made a good case," she said. My heart hammered with an unsettling combination of anxiety and hope. 3 days crept by at a snail's pace. I waited by the phone as Davina promised to call the instant she heard anything. The anxiety built to a point where I couldn't function normally. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked haunted, pale skin, circles under my eyes. Finally, the call came. Davina's tone was subdued. The judge agreed there was enough suspicion of fraud to keep the sale proceeds frozen. He stopped short of invalidating the sale, though, meaning the technical ownership still rested with the buyer. But that buyer's money would remain in escrow, safe from Michael. It was a small victory. I slumped onto the sofa, tears burning my eyes, relief mingling with frustration. Michael wouldn't get to pocket the profit, but I still didn't have my home back. If the new owner wanted to push me out, they had every right to do so. We'd only managed to block Michael's access to the funds. Davina said quietly, "We need more evidence. The judge wants a full trial to determine if the sale should be reversed entirely." This is only the beginning. My head dropped back against the couch. The thought of a lengthy trial, the expense, and the emotional toll weighed on me like a lead blanket. But I also felt a spark of determination. Michael's plan wasn't working quite as smoothly as he'd hoped. Then, out of nowhere, a private investigator contacted Davina. He claimed to have information about Michael's financial activities, details that could blow open the entire case. When Davina told me, I felt my palms grow clammy. Could this be some sort of trick? But desperation urged me forward. We set up a meeting in Davina's office, the investigator arriving in a rumpled jacket, carrying a battered briefcase. He displayed documents that indicated Michael had not only funneled money overseas, but also financed a new property in a different state, under a different name. My heart jolted so fiercely that my hand slammed onto the desk. Davina's pen clattered to the floor. If we could link these transactions to the funds Michael stole, we might prove a pattern of deception and intent to defraud. That could strengthen our case. The investigator asked for a significant fee to continue digging. It was money I didn't have. Davina hesitated, then offered to handle part of the cost herself, taking it out of whatever settlement I might eventually receive. I swallowed a lump in my throat and agreed. This was our best chance to corner Michael legally. Just when I dared to feel a spark of confidence, a new blow arrived. I got home one evening to find a formal notice taped to my front door. The buyer who'd purchased the house intended to take possession within the week. My stomach sank, chest tightening until I could barely take a breath. This was happening too soon. I read over the legal language, heart pounding. The buyer had the right to occupy the property. My only barrier was the possibility that the court might later reverse the sale. But for now, the buyer was choosing to exercise ownership, which meant I had to vacate. My throat went dry. The buyer had probably waited for the hearing's outcome and decided to move in anyway, confident in their purchase. In a panic, I texted Davina. She replied that we couldn't stop the buyer from coming unless we got a court order, which we didn't have. And trying to get that order would be an uphill battle in the short time we had. My hands shook so badly that I could hardly type a coherent response. I imagined myself forced to pack up everything, with nowhere to go. An overwhelming sense of loss and injustice pressed down on me. It was as though everything I'd fought to hold onto was slipping through my fingers at the last moment. Cramming my clothes, photo albums, and keepsakes into suitcases felt like a final surrender. I tried not to break down in tears, but each item reminded me of the life I once believed was real. I found old postcards from our honeymoon, Michael's notes from the time he was traveling for work, his attempts at sweet messages. Seeing them now made my eyes sting, my breath shaky. I shoved them into a box, unsure if I wanted to burn them or keep them as evidence of some fleeting past. On my final night in that house, I couldn't sleep. Every shadow in the empty living room seemed to taunt me. My phone buzzed at midnight, and a fearsome dread seized me. But I forced myself to look. It was Michael. He'd sent a single message: "You should have just accepted the divorce. It didn't have to get this messy." My arms tensed, and my lips pressed into a thin line. I pictured him somewhere smugly confident, believing he'd outmaneuvered me again. I couldn't let his gloating break me, so I turned off the phone and stared at the ceiling until dawn. I ended up staying on Harriet's couch next door, leaving the house to the new owner. From her window, I could see them unloading furniture from a truck, carrying it through the same doorway where I'd once envisioned decorating a nursery. I felt an unsettling calm, like the numbness that follows an intense burst of pain. Harriet offered me cups of tea I barely touched. She could see the tension in my shoulders, how my eyes tracked every movement across the street. I kept telling myself it wasn't truly over, that if we won in court, the sale would be invalidated. But the reality was that my home was gone, perhaps for good. Davina called to check on me. She urged me not to give up, because the real trial was on the horizon. The private investigator had found more leads. Apparently Michael had created a shell company. My heart pounded at the news, my fingertips drumming against Harriet's coffee table. If we could prove that he'd orchestrated a fake sale, funneling the money through that shell company, we might have a conclusive case. But to prove all that in court would require time, money, and an iron resolve. Harriet offered me a spare key to her place, telling me I was welcome until I found more stable housing. I found myself blinking rapidly at her kindness, sinking onto her faded floral couch. My lungs felt too tight to form the words "thank you," but she patted my hand gently, understanding my unspoken gratitude. That night, I managed to get a few hours of fragile sleep, though nightmares of empty rooms and mocking laughter haunted me. The next morning, I woke to a text from Davina that jolted me upright. The private investigator had discovered a critical link between the buyer and Michael. Apparently, the buyer might be one of Michael's distant acquaintances. That meant the entire sale could be a sham transaction, designed to funnel money into Michael's pocket while making it appear legitimate. I nearly dropped my phone. This wasn't just an accidental buyer, who had no idea about the fraud. If this was the break we needed, we could blow Michael's scheme out of the water, maybe even face criminal charges. I felt a spark of fierce determination that made my hands steady for the first time in weeks. It took another grueling month, countless legal motions, and every ounce of emotional strength I could muster. I lived in Harriet's cramped spare room, turning down her offers of nightly dinners because I felt too restless to sit for long. I'd pace back and forth, phone in hand, always bracing for another twist. Michael stayed silent, perhaps sensing his advantage slipping. At one point, Davina quietly told me that Michael's lawyer had tried to negotiate. If I dropped my allegations of forgery, Michael would agree to some minor financial settlement. My entire body stiffened at the suggestion. After all he'd done, the thought of accepting a few scraps made me nauseous. I refused. Finally, the day of the trial arrived. I stood in the courthouse corridor, sweaty palms clutching a file of evidence, emails, text messages, bank statements. Davina patted my shoulder. Her posture was rigid with purpose. The tension in the room was palpable when we entered. Michael sat at the defense table, avoiding my gaze. His lawyer looked weary, possibly from trying to hold together a now unraveling con. The so-called buyer was present too, arms folded, glancing around as if bored by the proceedings. But as Davina methodically laid out the facts, showing how Michael set up the shell company, how the buyer was linked to him, how my name was deliberately omitted from the deed, I caught glimpses of recognition in the judge's eyes. This was no mere he said she said spat. It was systemic fraud, and we had the receipts to prove it. When it was Michael's turn to testify, he tried to maintain a facade of confidence. But with each question from Davina, his composure cracked. He stammered when confronted with the wire transfers. His cheeks reddened at the mention of the shell company. That smirk he'd worn so easily before was nowhere to be found. My pulse was racing so fast I could barely stand still. After hours of arguments, the judge asked pointedly, "Why would your wife have hundreds of texts referring to joint ownership if, as you claim, she never intended to be on the deed?" Michael fumbled for words, but the silence spoke volumes. By the end of the trial, the tension was thick enough to taste. The judge declared he would issue a written ruling within days. I left the courthouse feeling both drained and oddly liberated. I'd faced Michael down, exposed his manipulation, and refused to let him bully me into submission. Harriet took me out for coffee that afternoon, and for the first time in months, I could sip it without a knot twisting my stomach. The final judgment arrived in a meticulously worded document. The judge found the sale fraudulent, invalidated the transaction, and ordered the buyer's money returned. More importantly, the court recognized my co-ownership interest in the property and ruled that Michael had forged documents to exclude me. My eyes scanned the text multiple times, each sentence unlocking the chains of fear that had held me captive. The home was mine, well, half mine, at least. I discovered that ironically, the mortgage was already paid off because of the undone sale, and the court demanded that any windfall from that situation would be split after an independent audit of our finances. Michael was ordered to reimburse me for the funds he siphoned off from our joint account. I almost dropped the letter, my hands shaking with raw emotion. But the personal victory went beyond the house. Michael now faced possible criminal charges for the forgery. As I stared at the document's final lines, I felt a trembling in my chest I hadn't experienced in a long time. Relief, yes, but also a powerful sense of reclaiming my dignity. Harriet hugged me so tightly I had to catch my breath. Davina called with congratulations, cautioning me that appeals might happen. But for now, the law recognized what had truly happened. A week later, I finally stepped back into my home. The buyer had moved out, surprisingly without much fuss, after the court mandated the return of their money. The rooms looked barren. I was nearly afraid to touch anything, half expecting it to vanish like an illusion. But as I ran my hand across the banister, I felt a sense of belonging, tempered by the memory of betrayal that had nearly cost me everything. I opened the windows, letting sunlight flood in. Michael didn't show up. He sent no apology, no explanation. I heard through Davina that he was negotiating a deal to avoid a trial for the forgery charges. I didn't dwell on it. The man who'd once been my husband was a stranger to me now, and perhaps he always had been. Standing in that living room, I took a shaky breath, remembering the nights I'd lain awake, the boxes I'd hastily packed, the phone calls that haunted me. None of that could be erased. But I was still standing. The house was silent, waiting for me to decide what came next. Eventually, I'd probably sell the place on my own terms. Maybe move somewhere smaller, more manageable, somewhere free of the memories that still clung to the walls. But that decision would be mine, no underhanded schemes, no mocking phone calls, no controlling manipulations. For now, I could breathe freely. My hand steadied as I set down my keys, my heart steadying with them. I'd discovered a strength within myself I never knew I had, forged in the fire of betrayal. This homecoming wasn't a triumphant parade, but it was real, it was mine, and it was enough to remind me that even when everything is taken away, resolve can still burn bright.